Hello, my name is Zahava Doering. I'm a social scientist in New York City. Today we're going to talk about people in museums and people. In the last few decades, museums' attitudes towards the people who cross their thresholds were shifting somewhat towards a more inclusive and welcoming approach. Ongoing efforts and new initiatives motivated by altruism, commercialism, or both came to a hard stop in early 2020. New demands and responses were mandated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent institutional lockdowns, restricted population movements, a severe economic downturn, and racial reckonings. Amidst the tsunami, museums found themselves in cultural crosshairs as they navigated between institutional and public concerns, safe and risky responses, experimentation versus reliance on past successes, and much more. 20 years ago, I set out to describe the evolution of attitudes and behaviors of museums towards the public. This juncture in cultural life propelled me to revisit what I had done and try to look ahead. This is an opportunity to share my thinking. Without entering the ongoing fray of museum definitions, it's safe to say that the United States has upwards of 35,000 museums and that about 1/4 of the US population visits a museum at least once each year. The demographic characteristics of museum attendees show a social class hierarchy in attendance among museum types, as well as racial and ethnic disparities. At one end of the spectrum are art museums, while attendance at zoological parks is the most egalitarian. But this story begins in the early 19th century. The first American purpose-built museum building opened in 1814. It was a townhouse with a 2-story wing and back, the Peel Museum in Baltimore. Other early American museum buildings took their cues from Europe. These palace museums were intended to convey power and awe. Even today, entering any 19th century museum, after ascending a flight of stairs, seeing Greek revival facades, arches, vaults, unconsciously signals a sense of reverence in most visitors and apprehension in some. By the end of the 20th century, dozens of museums designed by well-known architects dotted the American landscape. When these new museums were designed, they had new space requirements, not only large halls in which to display objects. They needed to include educational facilities, restaurants, shops, auditoriums, and spaces that could accommodate elaborate dinners and social functions. At the same time, the architectural evolution retained the aura of awe and reverence, but in a modern guise. Implicit class-related codes of behavior and dress have accompanied museums throughout their development. Codes of behavior, understandably, don't only fluctuate with time, but with cultures and frequently with personal characteristics such as age. For the most part, dress for museum visits followed the prevailing middle-class norms throughout both 19th and 20th centuries. More recently, especially in large areas, dress differences have tended to blur. Governance, funding, staffing, shown here on the right, also have an imprint on relationships with people. However, our time does not permit going into detail. It is also important to note key assumptions about people made by museums in the early 19th century as well as today. First, the museum is responsible to effect change in the knowledge, information, and attitudes of those who come. And effectiveness is always measured from an institutional perspective. It assumes that we have goals and success is the extent to which they respond in the way we intended. Jokingly, I might say, we think of them a little bit like dogs. They're trainable. Let's go back. In 1999, I looked around me at museums and I did see a residue of the first public museums in Europe and the US where people were defined as strangers. In this orientation, the museum maintains that its primary responsibility is to the collection and not to the public. Many curators understandably take this posture. Such museums emphasize object accountability. The public, while admitted, is viewed as strangers at best and intruders at worst. The public is expected to acknowledge that by virtue of being admitted, it has been granted a special privilege. The public, in turn, has no expectations of the museum beyond admission and abiding by the rules and regulations the institution may set. While the number of museums continued to grow throughout the next 150 years, in the US, the number of museums grew about fourfold in the last half of the 20th century. Of the 16,000 museums reported, almost 90% had been established since 1950. During the same 50 years, the museum profession as a whole put increasing emphasis on the role of museums. AAM published many reports to stress its educational role. The results? Museums treating people who visit as guests. In this posture, perhaps most common in our museums today, the museum assumes responsibility for visitors. It wants to do good. Do good means educational activities and institutionally defined objectives. The visitor guests are assumed to be eager for this assistance and receptive to this approach. Much like in the picture, baby birds coming in, opening their beaks and waiting for mama to stuff them with knowledge. But at the end of the 20th century, new pressures began to mount on social institutions. The pressure to be accountable for products, to demonstrate effectiveness and social worth, to show that they're successful. In fact, in 1997, Steve Weil suggested that the role of museums towards the public will change, quote, radically, and will have been transformed from one of mastery to one of service. The idea that a museum could be accountable to an individual who visits in the way a professional is accountable to a client originated in the corporate world. Corporate management principles and approaches, especially from the service sector, were being applied to museums with increasing frequency. In 1999, I didn't believe that museums needed to redefine their roles. However, in 1999, I did believe that museums needed to acknowledge the implications of being a leisure time activity and to think of themselves as service institutions, perhaps more akin to libraries than to universities. They would see themselves, if they did this right, as a resource for personal development, places in which the needs of users like those of readers in the library, are primary and respected as such. This thinking led to considering the role of a museum towards the public as that of a client. Here, the museum definitely believes that its primary responsibility is to be accountable to the visitor. It's no longer subordinate to the museum. It no longer seeks to impose an experience it deems most appropriate. Rather, it listens. About 15 years after the first paper was published, I had an opportunity to look at this again. What was clear is that the attitude of stranger still existed. Guests were the majority view, and client never really took off as a relationship, nor was it prominent in much of the writing. However, several things happened between 1999 and 2014. First, visitor experience moved to the center of a changing museum culture. This involved making better use of content and elevating the offering to create more holistic, engaging, and quality visitor experiences. Digital technology allowed for a dramatic increase in access to information, education, and interaction. And most importantly, it gave people control over the experience they want. Thus, in the second decade of the 21st century, it seemed appropriate to borrow a term from technology and define the relationship as that of a user. It was to be the relationship we aspire to create between people and the institution, and the de facto relationship that exists for most people who come to these institutions. And what it really meant is, rather than obedient dog, at the end of the day, people are a lot more like cats and do whatever they want. So, where does that bring us today? Initially in the background, but moving increasingly to center stage, has been the new museology. Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimlet wrote in 1998 that museums were once defined by their relationship to objects. Curators were keepers, and their greatest asset was their collections. Today, they're defined more by their relationship to visitors. Curatorship has gradually turned away from object-based research towards a practice of exhibit making on the margins based on community-driven projects and participatory approaches. In 2010, in the Participatory Museum, Nina Simon advocated that museums ought to become places geared towards social change. That is, places intended to change the world rather than only interpreting it. Places that can facilitate people's understanding of their role and place in society, and hopefully find tools to better interact, communicate, and share knowledge with others. Such projects, especially if museum-wide, require major institutional reorganization and reconfiguration. They also require a definition. Thus, in the past year, I have begun to advocate the term partner. When you have partners, museum staff view users as experts in their own experience who can share worldviews, knowledge, successes, and failures with museum staff and be listened to. In this exchange, partners learn to appreciate the perspectives, experience, knowledge, and know-how of museum staff. Key, of course, is changing authority in the relationship and changing the traditional scholar-curator model. Authority more broadly is not a commodity to be balanced, but rather shared. And I'm saying not sharing authority, but a shared authority. The former, sharing, implies a top-down view, somehow that museum have it to share. And a shared authority affirms that museums and the public share in the interpretive and meaning-making process. The museum doesn't decide what's exhibited. And we have lots of examples. They're small, they're at the edges, but I would argue that they need paying attention to. All along, I haven't talked much about staff. It's easy, of course, to see that when you have a stranger, you have a guide who sometimes responds. In the guest situation, we had docents who explain, but explain with a text written by the museum. Whereas in the model I'm proposing, we have facilitators. They listen, and learning is two-way. And so, moving from strangers in palaces to mentions and guests and users in museums, I propose that we move, as we move forward in the decade, to partners and a platform. The museum has some types of authority that it can have. It can set the rules, it can preserve and use user-generated content, it can define the interaction available to users, and it can promote moral and ethical behavior. And so to end, trust your mission, but trust your partners. Your goal is not to replicate yourself, but to present your partners with a tool and watch. Big ideas need to be stated in big ways. And the museum can be a powerful form for saying, this is the kind of world that we want. The museum must trust its partners to make creative adaptations, for each user knows her personal world in the ways the museum cannot. Thank you.